Hi guys, it's Ricky Pope, and today on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast, I talk with Dan Smith, published author and Christian nerd, as well as the host of the Coffee in Space podcast. And we'll get to all of that right after this. 2022 is flying by so fast, and I just reviewed my goals for the year. It's not too late to set some effective goals for 2022 for yourself. And the Goal Process 101 ebook helps you do just that. With a straightforward process and practical exercises, you'll be guided to set the right goals for you and set out a plan to achieve them. Get your copy of the Goal Process 101 ebook by going to goalprocess101.com. Use CNU2022 at checkout to save 10%. Now, back to the show. The past couple of weeks, I've been interviewing different kinds of authors, and this week I keep that up with our interview with Dan Smith. But before we get to the interview, let's start with some scripture. Let's start with Deuteronomy 31, 9 through 12. So Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the Levitical priests, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. Then Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, in the year for canceling debts, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before them in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and children, and the foreigners residing in your towns, so they can listen and learn to fear the Lord your God and follow carefully all the words of his law. And 2 Kings 22, 10 through 11. Then Shaphan, the secretary, informed the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. I love these two passages. First, in Moses' case, Moses makes it clear that the people should read, learn, and obey the scripture. And in the second passage, when King Josiah heard the words of God, he was so moved he tore his clothing from the guilt and sorrow he felt. It's clear that Moses and Josiah saw the need for the word and the impact that it had on his people. I firmly believe that reading the word of God will change your life if you allow it to. And I think that's why many people write. They want to impact people's lives. And today's guest has something to say about writing. Dan is a career U.S. Navy Chief Warrant Officer, a husband, father, and of course, a Christian nerd. He has been writing since he was a kid and was first published at 22. And as the host of the Coffee in Space podcast, Dan has interviewed and learned from tons of science fiction authors. So let's get right into the interview. Dan, it is so great to have you on the show today.
I'm really happy to be here.
I'm looking forward to talking some sci-fi and about novels and about writing and just kind of getting into it. But first, kind of tell our audience, who Dan is.
Oh, well, thanks. First of all, for having me on the show. I've been wanting this for a long time. And you got a great show. And the group is great
Appreciate
too.
it.
Yeah, the group is great too. So I am, if you listen to my podcast or read any of my works, I am S. Daniel Smith. My first name is Sheldon, and I do not go by that. Although I stopped before Sheldon became popular because of Big Bang Theory, but it's too late to go back now. I started going by my middle name, so I go by Dan. Dan's fine, but I write and I podcast as S. Daniel Smith. I am a career Navy Chief Warrant Officer. I've been in for a little over 25 years. I have a wife. I've been married for almost 21 years. We have 3 children and a dog and a cat. Like, we're pretty rounded out family, American dream stuff. But that's me. And then so I podcast. I'm a published author, and I've got some other hobbies going on that I'm hoping to turn into some cool things.
Awesome. Now, your podcast is Coffee in Space.
Coffee in Space.
Did I get that right?
Yeah.
It's a great podcast. I've listened to it, and you interview all sorts of authors.
Yeah.
What is that like, interviewing authors?
It's so awesome. So I'm a sci-fi fan. I mean, there's a reason I'm on the show, I guess, but like, I'm a nerd just as much as anybody else. And so because I like to write, I have connected over time with different authors. And so during the pandemic, I decided to start a project, and I was going to interview some of them, and they were gracious and they agreed to do it. And so it's just been really great. I'm learning tons about world building, because it's like, as a reader, I take in what they're saying or what they're writing or whatnot. But getting to know what was their thought process behind what they did, what they wrote, or why they made a character do a thing, I get to ask all these types of questions. And so it's really a lot of fun to get to do that. And it's really enjoyable.
Who was kind of your favorite sci-fi author to interview?
Oh man, that's like asking me to pick which child I like the most. Like the most, I might add. I've had a lot of great ones. It really is hard to narrow it down. I will tell you, the one that surprised me the most at how accessible he was Andy Weir, who authored The Martian, and he's had a couple other books as well. I was very surprised at how accessible he was to a small-time guy like me. I enjoyed C. Robert Cargill, who is a novelist, as well as he was a screenwriter for Doctor Strange, the movie.
Okay.
And he was really great to talk to. So I guess I would probably say that those 2 interviews were the funnest, the coolest ones to do, because they brought a certain surprise to that. But a guy I keep having on, who keeps coming back, his name's Derek Kunsken, and he is a Canadian author, and he's spot on the show every time he's there. He's been on like 5 times, because he's a great author and he's a great guest. So it's hard to really pick which one I truly love the most or had the most fun with, but those 3 authors probably at least narrow it down a little bit.
Awesome. Now, for me, when I look at, sci-fi novels, I really gravitate to some of the older classic sci-fi novels versus some of the newer ones. Although I do listen to some of the newer, sci-fi, dystopian, YA kind of authors as well. But do you have kind of a particular genre of sci-fi that you're interested in? Like for me, hard science fiction is more my thing, rather than the science fantasy or things like that. How about you?
I have always been a sucker for a good space opera. I want spaceships, interplanetary politics. I want someone stabbing somebody else in the back, literally or figuratively. And I'd like a good space battle in there if they can. So I've really enjoyed the Expanse series, the books more than the show, but the show's actually okay. I think they do a good job of representing the books. So that's just an example of a recent one that I've enjoyed. I have actually, like what you're talking about, gone back to the classics recently. In the last year, I have read Walter M. Miller Jr.'s book, Canticle for Leibowitz. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So it's a post-nuclear war dystopia. Yes. Fantastic book.
Yes, it is.
As long as you read it as it was intended at that time, and you understand the cultural context. And so that was a good one. And then there's been some other authors as well. I'm kind of also interested in nuclear war fiction. That's something else that comes in. That's Walter M. Miller. His was based on a dystopia after a nuclear war. And there's others too, David Brin and some others. So those are all good ones too.
Does that dystopian, post-apocalyptic kind of idea, is that something that appeals to you in science fiction more so than the idea of Earth expanding out into the universe?
Clarify what you mean on that end part, the expanding into the universe.
Well, I mean, we see some novels that are, post-apocalyptic. The world's basically coming to an end, and there's a few people left trying to survive and struggle. And then there are books like, Foundation, where it's the human race has expanded so far out that that Earth is a myth at this point.
Yeah.
So there's those two kind of dichotomy.
Yeah.
Where do you kind of lean?
That makes a lot of sense now that you've explained it to me. John Scalzi, by the way, writes he's got a couple of series out about Earth, humanity expanding out into the universe. In fact, his Old Man's War, one of his first big novels, was about that. Which I think Old Man's War is probably the one that really made him famous. So both of those, and there are obviously others as well. In fact, Gareth Powell, for anyone who knows the British author Gareth Powell, he's got a one coming out next month that is about humans going out into the stars. It's a good book as well. I can definitely appreciate it, and I see the draw to it because, even as we are finding more and more exoplanets out there that could sorry, Jeff Foxworthy, could support life. The idea that they would be anything we would know how to relate to is awful hard to grasp. And then, of course, I know that there's a faith context in there for guys like us.
Yeah.
About whether, humanity is the only species that can do what we're doing and whatnot. But the idea that life could be out there, but that would be relatable to us is pretty hard to grasp. So it's easier to do an idea where, well, they're humans too, and it's been so long into the future or far into the future that Earth really doesn't exist anymore. I can see the pull for it, and I see why it's popular. I have enjoyed a lot of it. Some Asimov's, Scalzi. But I'm more of, and I'm not a survivalist at all. I'm not ready for the world to end because I don't know how I'd handle it. But I like the idea. I guess because I grew up in the Cold War. I like the idea of that nuclear war fiction and what would happen afterwards.
Gotcha. And and you're working on some projects that kind of revolve around that.
Yes.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And it's something where so I have to be kind of careful. And I mentioned this in my own podcast when talking about the apocalypse as a person of faith. I have to be careful about what I do because there's apocalyptic fiction that is very clearly fiction. The nuclear war fiction we've talked about, climate fiction, although some of it looks pretty scary real. The far-flung parts of it are still fiction. Alien invasion is another example. Asteroid hitting the Earth. There's plenty of ways to die, as it were, and to create an apocalypse. But as a person of faith, I do have to be careful about it because I don't believe it's all fiction. I just believe that there is a huge subset of it that is fiction. And so I just got to be careful. But I do enjoy it. And so as a reader, as a consumer of science fiction, I enjoy the subgenre, if you will, and I've just started researching it. Why do we like it? What about us throughout history? Because Christianity is not the only religion or faith background that has apocalyptic writings. So what makes us like it? Why? What does that say about us? So some of these things are kind of frame my reading and my research, and then like, what would it be like to survive a real one? Like, put the dystopian fiction aside for a second.
Mm-hmm.
If the nuclear bombs fell, what would it really be like? And obviously, it would be horrible, and it would get worse before it got better, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of these old authors, they really capture that sort of thing well. And I wanted to learn more about it. And so that kind of led me into this research project. My publications are in nonfiction for the most part. And so that's the form of writing that I'm most comfortable with. And that's where I'm at now. So that's what I'm doing. I have a working title, but I don't have, there's no book. You and I were chatting about it before. The book isn't done yet. I'm just working on a proposal, but it's a lot of fun.
Awesome. And what is kind of your goal for that? Do you kind of, have you started laying out kind of a where you want this book to go in the future? Or is this more of a, I want to look at all of the history of these novels and, why people are fascinated by it and see where it goes? I know some people kind of have a point at the end that they're aiming for, and other people say, I want to see what's out there and see where it points me.
That's a great question. First of all, let me start with that. And the reason it's good is because as an author, we sit down and we kind of lay out kind of what, basically what we want, even if we don't plot it all the way out.
Mm-hmm.
And many authors, they have different ways of their doing it. And I sat down and I was like, here's what I want to do. I want to find out all the different main types of apocalyptic fiction that we enjoy. I want to find out then from psychologists, sociologists, I want to find out why we like it and what that says about us. And so that was my original intent, was just that. The theme was basically, why do we as humans want to know more about the end? And as a side project, I want to be careful about how I say that, because as a Christian, it's never really a side project. But as far as writing this book, it was a side effort. Was to find out how the faith plays a role in that. As I have done my research, as I have read some of these stories and worked on this proposal, I have learned that maybe I want to research more about what it would take to survive the real thing, and see, just what percentage of the human population would probably survive. And the thing that kind of really helped me focus on that was, first of all, in another Facebook group I'm in, military fans of science fiction and fantasy, it was brought out that everyone thinks that they're going to be in that 1% of humanity that survives, but they have no idea what's really going to take to survive X apocalypse. And so that's true. That's, and luck plays a big role in that. If you're, for the people who love the Marvel universe, if you got snapped out of existence, that's what happened. You got snapped out of existence. You didn't play a role in that. That was just luck, really. So then you get to decide, how am I going to handle this thing now that I wasn't snapped out of existence, or the bombs fell? I live in a precarious place. I live near a Navy base. I'm going to get bombed if it's a nuclear war. I probably don't stand much of a chance of surviving that. But if I were back home in Kansas, like I was growing up, I was probably not going to get bombed. And so then the survival starts, as the temperatures change and the ice comes and the nuclear winter, how do I survive? And so that's kind of been a new thrust of the research, is what does it take to actually survive the apocalypse?
Interesting. That's kind of interesting. And while you were talking about that, two particular classic sci-fi novels kind of came to mind. One is Fahrenheit 451, where, spoiler alert, why is this a spoiler alert? This book's like 50 years old. At near the very end of the book, he has escaped town. He has escaped the city, and he's living with this small group of people while they watch the cities be bombed from a distance. And why do they survive? Because they left. And then there is, in the Martian Chronicles, one of the stories in the Martian Chronicles, they watch the Earth destroy itself in nuclear war from Mars, and they discuss, where, we're Earthlings, and then at the end it's, we are the Martians now, because there is no Earth, because it, and why did they survive? They survived because they left. So that's an interesting idea of how and why would someone survive. And like you said, you live next to a large air base. I actually live very close to a large air base as well. So I'd be in the same boat. But it's interesting. Well, what do you see as kind of, you've been interviewing all these authors. What's a common thread you see in science fiction when these authors are trying to tell their stories?
So that's a really great question too. I will find new ways to say that's a great question at some point in this interview, but but it is a great question, and it's one I've been asked before, and it's hard for me to couch it in one or two things, because writers are unique, just like the rest of humanity. All of us are unique, and but they seem to come down into a couple of groups. Some of them just want to entertain their readers, and that's okay. I don't have any problem with that. I like being entertained as much as anybody else does. So that's one grouping. They want to entertain, and so they write an entertaining book, and it's entertaining. Well, hopefully it's entertaining. But then there's a large grouping of science fiction authors, and so the theme running through their books, they want to advance a cause, whatever that cause is. They want to advance a cause, and so whether it's intended from the beginning or if it's added in or developed over time, there is a message to be talked about. And I'll give you an example. I had a couple authors on, I think back in October or November. They wrote a book called The Offset. It's about it's a dystopian long after massive global climate change. And what they told me when they sat down to write this book, they called it to problematize climate change and to bring the problem to the forefront so that people could start thinking about it. And so while they didn't advance a particular ideology of how to fix it, because their story took place so far into the future, nothing we are going to be able to do now is going to affect their storyline necessarily. But the interesting thing was that they wanted to bring attention to the issue. And so I think that there's a huge theme running through a lot of science fiction, particularly science fiction, that there is the theme of trying to bring attention to a subject, an issue, and even in some cases how it could be fixed. There's also people who want to lay blame. I think that comes out sometimes too.
Yeah.
And so I think that you either are in a camp where your goal in a story, your theme, the thing that's running through it is to entertain in some way. And then there's I want to advance an issue and bring attention to it.
Awesome. Well, are there science fiction novels that you come back to again and again? It's like, are there novels that have moved you to the point is like, this is a novel I'm going to read, every year or every other year, something that you come back to?
That's an interesting question. And the reason I say it's interesting is because, and I have to confess, this may just make everybody mad, I don't reread books very often. And I think
not everybody's the same.
Yeah. And I think part of that's because my TBR, my to be read pile is, it's holding my desk up right now. I mean, I don't even need legs on my desk. And that's a little bit of that's a little bit of being facetious. But the fact is, I don't tend to go back and reread. What I do though is revisit the concepts of books over and over again. And so, in particular, the apocalyptic type of fiction, nuclear war. I go back to David Brin's The Postman often. Neville Shoots On the Beach. which was about a submarine crew who survived the war only to find it caught up to them in Australia. The Last Ship, which is not, the book is not the same as the TV show that was on AMC the last couple of years, although it was kind of based. Yeah, I know, but it was kind of based on it. But they took it. The original book was about a nuclear war, a ship that survived the nuclear war. The show is about biological, I think biological weapons, or a pestilence that went out of control. But so those are the kind of concepts that I revisit over time, and as particularly as new concepts come, well, people think they're new concepts come into science fiction. I go back and I was like, but actually it was kind of dealt with in this book a long time ago. It's kind of the same thing, just a different apocalypse, but that's kind of how I do it. I hope that doesn't offend too many people about how I feel. Now, the Matrix movie, I come back to it all the time, and I do watch it over and over again. And I will stand behind the first movie at the sacrifice of the others.
Well, since you mentioned movies, let me ask you this. Is there a book that you feel, a sci-fi novel that you've read, that you feel translated really well to film versus some of them that didn't? Now, you and I mentioned, I mentioned early on before we started recording, that one of my favorite novels, sci-fi novels, is Starship Troopers. I absolutely love the book. I am a guy who rereads things. I love reading things I already know happen. I am a hobbit. But it's a book I really love reading. The movie is horrible and it's barely based on the book. But is there a book that you feel like translated really well to film, whether it's older or newer?
Yeah, that's a good. And so people say that a lot in groups that I'm in on Facebook or even on Twitter, where they'll be like, "Hey, I'm looking for this particular thing. Can you make some recommendations?" And I'm just not good at that. And so this is kind of another thing where, like, I don't know that I'm a trustworthy source. I've watched a lot of movies and I've read a lot of books, but I don't read a lot of cross-connected stories. Now, to answer your question with my limited knowledge, I think The Martian did a pretty good job.
Okay.
I can't remember in which order I did it. I think I might have read Andy Weir's book first and then watched the movie. And it's of course not the same. It's never going to be. But I actually thought they did a pretty good job of putting it together. And then as far as this isn't in the movies, but TV show, I think The Expanse did a good job. Sci-Fi did good with the first couple of seasons of The Expanse. I wish they had kept it going. Amazon did okay with it. And so I think The Expanse has done well too. So I think there are examples of them that have done well. And I don't actually know a lot of examples of ones that didn't do well because I don't. If I hear it's not good, I'm probably not going to watch it. That's just how it goes.
I don't blame you one bit. I don't blame you one bit. So do you feel like there is a major difference between classic sci-fi? When I say classic sci-fi, when I think of classic sci-fi, the things that were written in the 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, early 90s, and what's being written today, like how old is The Martian? How old is that book?
That's
just like 10 years ago,
10 years
maybe
tops. Martian.
Do you see big differences? Do you see things that are majorly the same? What do you see there?
Yeah, I think there is a difference. And the reason I think there's a difference is I think show business has made it different. It has forced authors to be different. I'm thinking of A Canticle for Leibowitz and On the Beach, a couple of old nuclear war novels. They didn't go into detail with the flash bang and the wizardry that it seems to be the staple of a lot of books now. And, I think that there's a requirement both on the part of publishers and readers. Our expectations are different now, where we want more gizzardry. We want, we want the cool toys that's going to tell us how things are going to work in the future. And I don't know that it's necessarily bad. There are plenty of good authors doing great things right now. I wouldn't have a podcast without them, but I do think there's a difference. I think there's a little bit more introspection in some of the older novels. Because they could spend pages on what a character was thinking or doing that wasn't necessarily action,
things that wouldn't translate to the screen.
Right. Yeah. I really do think that. I mean, there's no way A Canticle for Leibowitz could ever be a real movie. Certainly not today. There's not enough going on. I think even on the beach, I mean, there's only so many shots of a submarine underwater you can get, or even when they are in Australia. I mean, how many days you're going to stand on the beach looking for the nuclear winter to hit you? I mean, that you just can't make a movie out of that.
Well, and I think of book trilogies are a big thing now.
Huge.
If you're going to write a book, you better be planning on writing 3. And you better write them so that there could be a movie made. And then I think of Orson Scott Card writing Ender's Game, and then his next book, Xenocide, or is that I don't remember which one's next, but the trilogy, the Ender original trilogy, you could never make those movies because they're so disconnected. The audience wouldn't follow it as a movie. Because you have a 10-year-old kid that destroys the creatures, and in the next book he's a grown man who's got a family, he's grown up, and his brother and sister are long behind him and are even older because of weird space dilation.
Yeah.
I think of books like that as like, that's not what we get. Those books don't get written anymore. No. It's got to be 3 books that tell one story that we can make movies about.
Yeah, I think and even if they don't end up getting to be made into movies, that is the expectation, both at publisher level and at reader level, is that you're going to astound me. You're going to have a twist that's so powerful that's going to just blow my mind for days. And I don't know that anything's been lost. Like I'm reading right now a book by Marco Kloss. He's a German American writer. And he's done his newest one's the Palladium Wars, which basically it's a trilogy. You could take Germany after the World War I defeat and stick them in this futuristic military novel, military sci-fi. And that's what you've got basically. And it's a fantastic book. It's not going to be made into a movie though, because, or I don't know that it would translate well to the movie because the characters are doing too much sitting around trying to figure out what's going on in their own heads, And so there are still books that do that. But even in his, there's the extra space battle that I don't know that needed to be there. I enjoyed it because I like space battles, but because that's the expectation on writers now.
Fascinating. Well, I know there are some of our audience that are writers. You are a writer. Now you're doing mostly nonfiction, but you interview people who are, novel writers, mostly fiction writers. Do you have some writing advice that either you have yourself or that you've received from some of these interviews that you'd say, this is something I'd want to share with somebody who's an aspiring writer out there?
Absolutely. I've got the piece, especially if you want to be a novelist someday, or you're working on becoming a novelist. And I have novels in the drawer that I'm still technically working on. I'm using air quotes. And I do always have a dream of being a novelist. But the piece of advice I got from several people out there, most recently by Derek Kunskin from my podcast interview, was start small, write a short story, figure out how to make a plot punch and stay tight with that writing. Learn to do it at 2,000, 3,000 words, 10, 15 pages of a story, and then build yourself out to where you're able to write novel length fiction, which, if people aren't familiar necessarily with word counts, a novel, a science fiction space opera, for example, needs to be around 100,000 words. That's a lot, and it's hard to keep a plot running for 100,000 words. Learn how to do it at 2,000 to 3,000 words first. And I think that I am close in my own writing, if I can be, introspective of my own position. I think I'm close with how to handle a story upwards of even 10,000 words, which is a novelette length. But focus on getting it done tight. Focus on a plot theme at the short level, and then start building out. And I think I can't remember exactly when I saw this as well, but I think it was Gene Roddenberry who gave that same advice. You could write 52 short stories in a year, or you could write a novel, and which one's going to develop your talent better? So those 52 short stories that you've written over the year. And by the way, that's almost impossible to do. I try to write a lot of short stories. I went on deployment last year, and I was like, all right, I'm going to be gone for about 6 months. That's, 6 times 4 is 24. I should be able to get 24, 25 short stories written. I think I got like 6, and I was pretty happy with myself by the time I was done. Awesome. It's hard to write that many stories. And, but in writing them, I learned how to write big stories.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because a couple of my absolute favorite novels, air quotes, are actually collections of short stories that the novelist later put together and kind of threaded together to kind of make a novel. I mean, ones that come to mind right off the top of my head, The Illustrated Man, and I, Robot is really, if you've seen the movie, that's not that's one story in the I, Robot novel, but it's a set of stories. And The Martian Chronicles, those are really short stories, or maybe, like you said, a novella. It's a small novel, the 10,000 words, the shorter ones, all put together, that kind of had similar ideas. So they feel like they might be one story, but they really weren't. They were never intended for that. A lot of these classic sci-fi authors got their start by writing for magazines, writing shorter stories. And so I think that's great advice. Well, I'm not a writer, and I'm astounded by anybody who does it well.
Yeah. Oh, me too. And I don't want to discount, like, if you go into Barnes and Noble in most places, the ones that still have full magazine racks, pick up a copy of Asimov's or Analog, those magazines that publish science fiction stories. Mm-hmm. There are some great stories in there. Yeah. And they're going to take you 15, 20, 30 minutes to read, maybe a couple of days for the longer ones. So there's a sense of accomplishment there too. But you'll kind of get to see, most novels have a slog in the middle where you kind of just got to get through it. There's not a whole lot going on. The characters are going to try and figure out how they got their fanny whooped earlier.
Yeah, it's that exposition scene in every movie that nobody wants to watch, but everybody has to.
Yeah, because it kind of just really gets us from the first defeat to the eventual victory or the eventual resolution. And short stories don't usually have those, though. There's no time. There's no space for them. You've got a specific thing to get through in these short stories. And so they tend to be more punchy. They tend to be more quick hitting. There's a lot of things to enjoy in short fiction as well.
Awesome. Well, Dan, it's been great to have you on the show. Tell our audience where they can find you real quick.
Yeah, and it's been great being here. I've had more fun tonight than I've had in a long time. So you can find me, really one-stop shop is www.coffeeindspacepodcast.com. Just all one word, coffeeindspacepodcast.com. Links to my socials are on there, Facebook. You can find out about our military fans Facebook group if any of your listeners are military folks or associated with the military. You can find out how to get a hold of me on Twitter. I have a contact section on there. And then, of course, I have the podcast on there as well. So coffeeandspacepodcast.com, everything's right there.
Awesome. Well, Dan, it was great having you on the show.
Yeah, it's been great being here. Thanks.
It was great having Dan on the show today and hearing all he's learned from the writers he's interviewed, as well as from his own personal writing experience. I've put links down in the show notes below to the Coffee and Space podcast, as well as some social media links for you to keep up with what's happening with Dan right now. Well, that's all we have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, just click all those buttons down there. We really appreciate it. And it really does help other people find our podcast, as well as help keep you informed when there's new content. And you can find all of our social links and links to our YouTube channel and to our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. And while you're there, click on the support tab. We would love to have you as our Patreon. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from Psalm 20. May the Lord answer you when you are in distress. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and grant you support from Zion. May he remember all of your sacrifices and accept your burnt offerings. May he give you the desire of your heart and make all your plans succeed. May we shout for joy over your victory and lift up our banners in the name of our God. We'll see you next week. Blessings.